All yours. 3:30. We've got a couple of items, informational, and then there's the consent agenda, and then there's some closed session items that we have to deal with. So let's be mindful of the time of the day, and if we could keep it to, as you normally would do, to the high points of your presentation.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, members of the board. Ed and I are here with Nick to discuss, to look at some impact of altered investment returns on the funding. I think some of the board members were interested in knowing what would happen if different investment returns occurred at different period of times, if we had some downturns, upturns, et cetera. So I'm just going to turn it over to Nick, and he's going to go through that, and then for Ed for other comments. So there you go, Nick.
Thanks, Rick. Good afternoon. As Rick said, at the April meeting, we presented a projection, and we did that in a deterministic fashion, which is basically assuming all assumptions were met. And we got some questions as far as, what happens if the assumptions vary, which we know they will. So the focus today is going to be on what happens if the investment returns are either higher or lower than assumed. And what we're going to see is, even with the funding legislation, which gives the board some limited ability to move contribution rates, funding investment returns are still going to have a significant impact on future funding ratios that you'll see. So as I said, our one set of assumptions was everything goes according to plan. That's called a deterministic projection. We've done a stochastic projection, which considers a variation of assumptions, which would provide a range of outcomes. And as Rick said, we're going to vary the investment return assumption, which historically has had the biggest impact on CalSTRS funding. We're going to do this using a stochastic model, and we're going to assume that the average investment return going forward is 7.5%, which is equal to our assumption and fairly close to what PCA's capital market assumptions give based on CalSTRS target asset allocation. So we thought that was a reasonable starting point, but we're going to factor in the standard deviation, which is going to show the variation in the investment returns going forward. Obviously, there's some other assumptions that will also have an impact, to a lesser or greater extent. I guess I'd mention one, which is sort of the wild card, which is payroll growth, which if, for example, something like you had a pension initiative and you were closed off to new members, that would have a significant impact on your payroll growth, and that would also have a significant impact where the funding legislation is payments based on the entire CalSTRS population. So if the CalSTRS population instead of increasing was decreasing, that would have a negative impact on the funding. So just want to give you a quick summary of how a stochastic projection works. This is called a Monte Carlo simulation. Basically, we come up with simulate 1,000 arrays of returns, and that's 32 years from 2014 to 2046, which is the end of our period. We generate those returns, and then we translate them, putting them through our model to what that would work through as contribution rates, or in this case, in the funded ratio. You can see we've only shown a few of those possible outcomes, but we've run 1,000 of those. And then what we need to do is now we have 1,000 potential future outcomes. And obviously, as you can see in the sort of what we call the spaghetti graph, there's a lot of volatility going to be in each individual scenario is going to move up and down. But what we want to do is kind of translate it in a fashion where it's sort of more understandable. And we do that by, excuse me, by ordering the results. So we look at each individual year, what the funded ratio was, and then we sort all the 1,000 funded ratios that come out of each scenario and order those, and then we put them in percentiles, with the average percentile being, the average kind of result being the 50th percentile. We're using good to represent the 25th percentile, and bad being the 75th percentile. To kind of describe that, for example, when we look forward, we'll look at each individual year. In the example here, in 2020, if the 75th percentile shows a funded ratio of 62%, that means 75% of the time you would have done better than 62%, and about 25% of the time you would have done worse. So this is kind of the results. The first thing you'll note is that yellow line down the middle, which may be a little hard to see, but hopefully you can see that. That looks very similar to what our deterministic projection we showed back in April, which is a gradually increasing funded ratio that reaches right about 100% in 2046. And what you'll also note is the red line being the bad scenario, and the the blue line representing good returns. You have quite a bit of variation. In a perfect actuarial world where we had complete control over the contribution rates, you'd see a lot less variation. But on the flip side, you have, as I've mentioned, you have some control over setting the contribution rates under the legislation, and we've reflected that in here. And if we didn't have that control, this would we'd see even more variance in the results. So in addition to the funded ratio, we looked at the impact of the state contribution rate. Once again, the yellow line, kind of the average of all the scenarios, is consistent with what we project in our evaluation, which is that the state contribution rate will decrease down to 2%, based on the express elevator, which is if the 1990 benefit structure becomes fully funded, then the state supplemental contribution rate, which grades up to about 4%, would then decrease. The supplemental would go to 0%, so the total contribution rate there would be 2%. But as you see, there's quite a bit of difference between the average returns, and then if you have bad returns, the unfunded would tend to grow, and then that would result in the significant increases in the state supplemental contribution rate. As you can see, by 2046, that would be the difference between about 2% and about 12%. So big difference depending on that, on the actual returns. The employer contribution rate, I want to talk a little about this one. The one thing that may, if you at first look, that looks a little strange is that under the bad scenario, you see the increasing rates under the fixed schedule. The fixed rates go up to about 2021, and then it becomes variable. And you see, even under the bad scenario, there's actually a decrease in the rates. And that really has to do with the way the evaluation policy is set up. And these kind of results, one of the things we've talked about before is taking the evaluation policy for a test drive. And taking it for a test drive, we felt like there's maybe one additional parameter that we'd like to add into the evaluation policy that would prevent this from happening. Because right now what we're doing is we look at the legislation says that the employer rate is based on the unfunded actual obligation based on pre-2014 service. It also talks about the state contribution rate, which is based on the unfunded actual obligation based on the 1990 benefit structure, and those two overlap. And we've kind of split them into two and tried to make them as independent as possible. But in looking at this, I think we need to look at that in total as an additional check, and if in total it's not being funded, then we need to adjust the employer rate accordingly. So no rush on this. As you know, the employer rate is fixed for a number of years, but we think the next time the evaluation policy is reviewed that possibly this change should be made. So in summary, on the basic points of this, the increase in the contribution rate is going to only do so much to increase. Yeah.
If I may, Mr. Unterman has a question.
So, see if I can phrase this right. We've had better than anticipated returns for the, I guess, first 2 years of your period there. Have you run scenarios where we alter the asset allocations to, in effect, bank those excess returns? And reduce the loss exposure that would otherwise come with the volatility?
No, we haven't. The point of this is more just informational right now. We're kind of leading into something that may go with that. And, in that type of thing, we'd probably would want to at least work with PCA or have them take the lead and work with us because, they're the experts on asset allocation, but we could definitely kind of reflect something like that in this type of model. So as I said, the board has limited ability to adjust contribution rates, but they're subject to certain caps on increases in the total employer contribution rate. So you do have some ability to move up the funding ratio when times are bad, but it is somewhat limited. There's a good chance of a significant decrease in the state contribution rate. As I said, kind of the expectation is about a 50% chance that the state contribution rate will drop back down to 2%. And lastly, as I said, we should probably review the valuation policy the next chance, maybe with the next experience study evaluation, to review the way the employer contribution rate reacts under bad investment returns. And one other question we had was, what happens as, we've done all this analysis based on this, potential future returns. We've looked at 1,000 scenarios, and we realized that only one scenario is what's going to happen. So what happens if that scenario includes a negative investment shock? For this, we've shown a 20% market loss. And then we've assumed some recovery after that, which is kind of similar, obviously, to 2008. We had very bad 2008, 2009, and then the markets have somewhat recovered. And that would look like this. And this is the funding ratio. The graph looks very similar to what we showed you before. The dashed lines there represent what the original funding ratio graph was, and then the solid lines represent what would happen if we had this 20% loss in 2030, and then some recovery, as you say, and this would still work out to an average return of 7.5%. But even on this average return, we would trail where we would otherwise have been with less volatility. And if if there was less recovery, the discrepancy would be even greater. Let's see, I covered those two. Just a note, we did a similar analysis if that 20% loss, instead of happening in 2030, happened just 5 years in the future, and that would allow more time to recover. So there was less difference, but in the between the dashed lines and the solid lines that we saw in the previous graph. So in conclusion, CalSTRS funding is significantly improved because of the funding legislation. Investment returns will still continue to have a significant impact on future funding levels. Just to give you some perspective, when we did the 2013 valuation, if we'd have applied the old funding, that yellow line, which we showed going to 100% in 2046, would have gone to 0% in 2046. So clearly a significant improvement. As I said, this is just informational. We're not asking for any actions. Just a couple things to think about for the future is when you're looking at asset allocation, as Mr. Unterman mentioned, you want to consider the impact it'll have on the contribution rates, and I think that's something that you're already doing. And as I said, there's that one issue with the valuation policy that is taking it for a test drive. We think a change might be appropriate. So that concludes my remarks.
Thank you, Ms. Collier.
Nothing to add.
Mr. Rosensteel.
Thank you. So this is very useful, and I think in particular as you described it, the test driving the allocation policy is really important and very instructive. But I want to ask a question about the other piece, which was what happens with the 20% drop, because I'm still having a hard time understanding that it's a truly stochastic approach. I mean, I see that what you did is you did a Monte Carlo simulation and you came up with roughly 5.9% or 5.7% at the 25th percentile, and then 7.5 at the 50th percentile, and 9 something at the 75th percentile. But it seems that what you did is you then assumed a 20% drop, but then you also assumed that was just dropped into a long run 30-year 7.5% return. So that what you did is, after you had that negative 20% drop, you then increased returns thereafter to get us back to 7.5% over time, over the 30 or 32-year period of the analysis. Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly correct, yeah. I mean,
Okay.
you know, if you dropped in a 20% loss on top of everything else, yeah, the picture would be a lot worse if you didn't assume any recovery. The reality is it's probably it's probably gonna be somewhere between no recovery and a full recovery.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
you know, in that respect, it's somewhat optimistic. But on the other hand, I mean, in the stochastic analysis, we had a number of scenarios that already had 20% losses in it.
Right, and I mean, I think that. I'm, and so I'm, and it seems to me those are actually sort of more relevant than given the analytical approach we're taking. I guess what I heard you say, and I think this is the important thing, because I think we don't know what's going to happen after a 20% drop. We could have a recovery, or we could not. So what you're saying is sort of this is at the optimistic end of what would happen if there's a 20% drop, but I wouldn't want us to think that as we think about an investment strategy, and partly in response to Tom's concept that, you know, maybe we should bank good years by creating a little bit of a defensive strategy going forward, that we should draw a conclusion here that we don't have a downside risk, because I think we could interpret it that way. And while we hope that, or down, you know, while we would hope we don't, and we have to be vigilant and careful to make sure that we protect against that. And that doesn't mean that we can assume that just because there's a 20% drop, we're going to have a recovery. Maybe we wouldn't have a recovery. So maybe we need to think about that possibility, maybe remote, but that possibility when we think about our asset allocation study.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with that.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Mr. Unterman?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I quite got what you were suggesting in terms of changing the valuation policy.
Okay, so right now, we look at the unfunded actual obligation for service attributable to 2014. And I apologize, you know, this is what's in the legislation, and we have done some interpretation. And part of that is going to be attributable to is going to be allocated to the state, and part of that's going to be allocated to the employers. And it's not exactly clear from the legislation. The legislation just says the employers are responsible for the pre-2014 unfunded actual obligation, but it also says the state is responsible for the 1990 benefit structure. So we try to isolate those two pieces, and we kind of put them, well, as I said, we kind of isolated them. But what happens is then if the state piece is being, you know, isn't getting enough money, then if the district piece is okay, we're not increasing the district rate, and it possibly would be decreasing the district rate even when the total piece was not getting enough funding. But the thing we're doing is on the flip side, we're saying, hey, if the state piece is overfunded, we're going to give this credit to the employers. So sort of not very symmetrical approach. And obviously, as you can see the way it flows through, it does adversely affect the funding, and that's why we think it's appropriate to change.
Information item. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Mr. Finley, Graham Finley. Good afternoon. Item 12 is the Project Risk Oversight Report. And this is informational. Does this give us a status of the big projects that are underway at a very high level relative to on time, on budget, anything that we really need to be concerned about? And I know you've been receiving some feedback. Ms. Higa has been kind enough to provide feedback to you and Ms. Linkcock based on some recommendations. So all you. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. Again, Graham Finley with Grant Thornton, here to provide our regular monthly assessment report on the pension solution and data preparation projects. As you mentioned, thanks to working with Joy and Cassandra as well, we've made some changes to the format of the executive summaries you get as part of your written packet. As we did in April, I'm going to basically present a few key points to each of the projects, and then I'll just take questions on anything you'd like to discuss. So to start with pension solution, it's pretty much been nothing but good news since we last met in April. Good to hear. So, okay, all right, thank you.
That's the work
Yeah.
Ms. Higa gets.
There you go.
Nothing but good news, very good.
All credit due. So you have project manager, we have a transition project sponsor. The negotiations with CGI are complete. The project team's been working to accelerate everything around the contract signing process. So it now looks quite likely that the contract will actually be signed by the end of this month, and CGI will be on the ground by the beginning of July, starting work. That means for the next, several weeks, the real hard charge for the project team is getting ready for the vendor to arrive. And there are a series of internal processes around contract management and project management that they're really focused on, so that they're basically ready for when CGI walks in the door. But a lot of progress just in the last couple of months. Any questions on pension? Okay. Let's talk about data prep. So you may remember that that there was a strategic path forward focus group that had been analyzing some of the complex data issues and trying to identify potential policy decisions that might help with data cleansing in preparation for the pension solution. That work is ongoing. They're working with the core data prep team to integrate that activity. The project team is still being impacted by a number of resource constraints, and that's slowed some of their work, particularly around some of the activities required for the initial data conversion that's expected. We do think there is a risk that the project might have trouble doing all of the work they need to do to be ready for that initial set of data cleansing. However, it's very hard at this time to know how material that risk is or whether it's a real risk because there are so many variables in play. Probably the biggest one is that we don't have a defined schedule at this point. There's a draft, but there really isn't a known duration that the project team has to work towards. That will change over the next 6 to 8 weeks because pretty much the first thing that CGI does when they hit the ground is develop a schedule. So by the time we come back in August, I imagine a number of these variables are going to be nailed down more, and we'll know whether this is really a real risk or something that's really being addressed. Okay. Any questions on data prep?
Ms. Ortega.
I think I would like to talk a little bit more about this, realizing that there'll be more information at the next meeting. But the language of the report that we have, the TRB 163 page, is pretty pointed in terms of the lack of resources and the potential need to the need to hire or contract key staff members and not use those resources on other projects. And so I'm wondering if is it really we should wait until next time and see what the project schedule is, or is there action that needs to start now in terms of thinking about?
Well, there's already action underway. For example, the project team is prioritizing their staff to work on those activities that are required for that initial set of data conversions, the initial releases. There are some pieces, though, that there's sort of three main variables that are going to impact this. One is the schedule. How long does the project actually have, to conduct this work before the initial set of data conversions? And as I said, there isn't a final schedule as yet, but we don't know. It's not as if this has to happen in the next couple of months. There's probably a year or so, to do this work. But there's an awful lot of work to do, and a year can go by very quickly. So that's one variable in terms of the duration. The second variable is the actual scope of work to be done. The project team has been documenting a set of what's called basic data issues, things that they know have to be cleansed, and they're piling those up into a set of work that they know they have to do. However, the output of that strategic path forward exercise with some of these policy decisions, depending on how those decisions come out, it could reduce the amount of work that the team has to do and reduce the extent the level of effort required. And then finally is the amount of resources, and there are conversations internally about how to address those resource challenges. And they're all playing out in this same couple of month time period. So I'm alerting it at this point that it's a concern. It's something I think that we need to be watching. But it's hard to say anything very concretely about is it really going to be an issue at this point until we get those 3 items nailed down.
Thank you.
No other questions, comments?
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well done. Thank you. Brings us to item 13 is the work plan for 15-16. Jack?
Yeah, that's on pages 167 and 168, the chart. And I'll highlight a few items, but I guess I'd maybe challenge us all to look at this chart and say, is there anything we should take off it? Kind of going to the commentary this morning, we should be focusing on the financial integrity of the system, paying benefits, all those things. Are these the things the board should be doing in its board meeting? The big items, of course, like every year, are your valuations. So, Nora, that's kind of like the big item of the year always, is to assess the financial standing of the plan from an actuarial basis. So we do that every April for all the different components of the plan. So that'll be quite a lengthy session. But this year is the cycle for the experience study, and that's tagged for April. And so those are your, what I would say, your 2 biggest items on the work plan. Financial statement review, like always, will be in November. It's important. From your work discussing cybersecurity, we've scheduled 2 sessions on that in November and April. And then I would ask you to look under Business Renew in addition to the reports that Graham will continue to give you each session. We do have a couple items relative to where the project stands on the pension solution itself, as well as a discussion on data stabilization. And that is really what we just had a minute ago that you were talking about. There could well be board decisions around that that could lead us to seeking legislation or regulation issues, or just decisions that are under the power of the board relative to conversion issues. So that will be a very important milestone. Right now, we're projecting February, but I think as we get farther down the year, we'll know for sure if that's the right month for that or not. Is there any different on that, Robin? No, yeah. Robin is our new co-sponsor of that, as we've noted to you in the analysis. Also, I wanted to highlight for you just the research, in case those titles don't mean anything per se to you, under the second page. We do a retirement readiness assessment report. I love this report. We do it every couple of years, and it really starts to get into people's personal, our members, that is, our members' preparedness for retirement in terms of the other savings vehicles that they use and their projections for retirement. It lets us understand the importance of the 403B and how we're doing there. And so it really digs into our members' activities, getting ready for retirement, and it gives us a sense of whether we're doing a good job or not. New this year are 2 reports that our research group is going to do. One is kind of bringing the literature together for you around retirement savings crisis. And although I know you all see these stories a bit in the popular press, I will tell you there's also some experts that have argued that on conferences I've been on, panels that argue there isn't a crisis at all. So we want to kind of organize some of that literature for you around that situation. And of course, that's a bit of what Secure Choice is about as well, is addressing that issue. The third study is going to be a special one for us. And I will tell you that we've got a number of other teacher pension systems that are going to look to you for what this study says. And this is the one that says how CalSTRS benefits fit California's educators. This is a growing topic around the country as critics attempt to make arguments that these defined benefit plans do not service the career patterns of educators. Many of our fellow systems don't have the resources we have as a system or the research group to look into this in depth. We'll be doing this study with an outside actuary and with a university to really look at our data and try to make some conclusions about this. There's been 3 or 4 studies from what I would argue biased think tanks that have made very sharp criticisms of the vesting periods for teachers and whether teacher mobility patterns have changed over time and whether this is still the proper retirement vehicle for teachers. And I think we want to have some objective research around that and start to shape that discussion. I was just at a meeting with fellow directors, and they asked me about where we are with this because they most definitely want to see what the findings of this are. So they're not just abstract generalizations about retirement and whether it's a good or a bad benefit, a defined benefit, but actually digging into real data among the membership and looking at their mobility patterns. And then the fourth one was actually a suggestion from your board chair, Harry Keeley, and that was to discuss with a university of doing a potential case study on CalSTRS relative to your successful funding strategy and what it takes to accomplish a funding strategy like that and the results that we got from the process. And Ed just received word that the university is very interested in doing that and has assigned a professor to begin that research. So that's kind of exciting as well. I couldn't hear you, Dan. I'm sorry, Dan.
University?
The Rotman School, University of Toronto. Actually, but the professor is from Harvard. The professor is from Harvard. They Toronto hired back to Harvard. I don't know why, but yeah. So that'll be neat for us. And if you like, we can present that to you as well when the professor finishes his work. So those are the highlights from that. Is there anything you see on here that you say, hey, the boards don't have to spend time with this, or this doesn't look right to you to make it more efficient, or do we have the right core items for you?
Ms. Dunsterman?
Well, I guess I've said this twice today, and I guess I'll say it a third time. So somehow I sort of think that 60–70% of our time should be focused on investment. And maybe the corollary would be analyzing strategies to deal with the unfunded liability, and which actuarial/investment. And as I look at the work plan, I can't point to anything that I don't think we should do, other than the fact that I don't see how we end up with 60–70% of our time spent on investment. And so that's just a general comment that hopefully would inspire some rework, if others agree with me.
We've tried to make it as lean as we can, but I'm more than willing to, as I kind of cluster things with my eyes on this, you've got, by minutes. I mean, I know how much these items take. I will say proportionally, clearly, the bulk is going to be around your actuarial work. That's part of that. No, that gets a little routinized, but that is I think. I assume you would agree that is definitely the responsibility of the board to look at those valuations and discuss those each year, because that probably from a time perspective is the biggest items on here, as well as some of the oversight responsibilities you do, financial statement review and budget preparation. I don't have a lot of fluff on here though, other than I think we're trying to find the balance on the technology oversight, and hopefully this meets your needs here. I don't want to do too much with that either if that's getting too detailed in the operations of the system. And
as I said, I can't tell you which thing I think we shouldn't do at all as I look at it, but somehow all of a sudden
it adds up a lot.
It's not, there isn't a focus on how we're making 7.5% or more every year, or guarding the objective of being fully funded in the target year. Not really sure what.
Wouldn't some of that be in the investment committee though?
Well, it would, but it seems to me it's also, but that, and if you include that in the totality of our time, then we're getting closer.
Siri not available. Your passcode is required with iPhone.
Little comic
Siri
relief.
doesn't know the answer.
Let's ask Siri this question.
for
See
that.
what we get from Siri.
What do you think?
Tom, I do think I tried to time this out. As you know, later in the agenda, we've got a new proposal and for your timing of the meetings, and this does time out to be a shorter board meeting.
Yeah, no, I'm sure that.
Unless we go astray here. But But I'm in a very hopeful spirit right now.
Let's keep let's keep it that way. So, Mr. Rosensteel.
I don't have an answer to the question that Tom raised, but I'm with Tom on where our focus should be. One of the concerns that I have, and it was part of the reason I asked the question when we had the gentleman from Milliman up here, and is I think that sometimes we segregate the actuarial discussion from the investment discussion in an inefficient way. We take the actuarial discussion is at the full board, the investment discussion is at the investment committee. We don't often bring them together in a way that's as integrated as they might be. And so I think part of what happens is the board sometimes hears two different things. We hear one version of reality from the investment consultants and one version of reality from the actuaries. And I mean, I think it would be useful if there were ways to integrate them, and I think that also may create some more efficiencies. I don't have an answer beyond that, but I think you know, those two issues and their integration, I agree, are the most important things for this board to have oversight on, because it's not just earning the 7.5%, but it's having enough money to make sure we pay benefits. That's really what we're all about. So we have to put the two together. And so that's all. I guess that would be the only thing I might suggest, is if there's some thought on that.
Those key people and just let us talk it through. See if there's a different way of doing that with both Milliman as well as the investment consultants and Chris and Ed and everybody here. Chris or Ed, do you have any perspectives on that?
I'll add, we are going to be at least trying to do more stochastic simulation on the asset allocation. But I think you're raising a point about, do you stochastically look at the liabilities and how those could change. I know PCA has access to the Milliman model. And what we'll want to do is make sure Makita has that too, and see how much they can integrate the two together.
Yeah, and I think the other issue, I mean, we can certainly model other variables. It's just, if you start modeling too many variables, it gets to be a tremendous mess of things in terms of looking at it. But we could model if you're looking at a particular asset allocation, I think Milliman could evaluate what implications that would have to the funding of the plan before you make that decision.
No, and I wasn't so much saying that. I was saying that I think a stochastic approach to the question that was just discussed, had it been in the hands of the investment consultants, might have been done differently. And I think that we benefit from. These are hard enough issues for this board to deal with without getting kind of one single story. That's all I'm saying.
So, all right, so anything else you want to highlight, Jack? All right, so we heard some feedback on the work plan. Jack, I got a little direction there. I think it's important to note that, some of the feedback we've heard about the report that Graham's been giving to us, we followed up with that, and some changes in that reporting seems to have been moving towards more meeting the board's needs. I think the structure of the meetings for next year is something we got feedback about. We've made changes there, so we're trying to be sensitive to the feedback that we're hearing and balancing the fact that we have 11 of us here, and we can't always do everything that people are suggesting. So, but we get the overall theme. We want to be efficient. We want to be focused. We want to be talking about the right issues and spending the right amount of time on those issues. Okay, so anything else? That's it, right, Jack?
That's it.
Thanks. Okay. So this is, these are the consent items. So 14A it says that this needs to be read during item 14A, so I will proceed to read this. Okay, 14A. By direction of the Audit and Risk Management Committee, I move to adopt the fiscal year 2015-16 audit plan, that the chief auditor will identify ways to increase employer audits and provide the results of that inquiry at the September 2015 Audits and Risk Committee meeting. By the direction of the Audits and Risk Committee, I move to adopt the amendments to the Audits and Risk Management Committee. Okay. 14B, this also needs to be read during 14A. This is from the Compensation Committee. It says to be read during 14A, so this is what I will do, I will read it. By direction of the Compensation Committee, it's only taken me like 7 years to figure this out, just read it. I adopt the revisions to section 700B of the board's policy manual regarding compensation of executive management and investment staff. By the direction of the Compensation Committee, I move to adopt the revisions to the compensation policy's administrative procedures regarding incentive opportunity for the Director of Investment Operations. 15A, nothing needs to be read. 14B is the approval of minutes of April 2nd. 14C is board member education. 14D is contracts requiring board approval. Anyone want to pull any of those items? Okay, seeing no pulls. 15A, there's nothing to be read. 15B is the proposed board meeting schedule for 15-16. Just want to note that in looking at the September meeting, we took into consideration the conflicts with Labor Day, et cetera. We were unable to really resolve that conflict because of other conflicts that existed, but we'll be mindful of that in future years, just as we were relative to the Jewish and Christian holidays in the spring, which we won't repeat next year. That's 15B is the schedule. Anybody want to pull that for comment? Or? Okay.
Call for a vote on 14A.
Yes. All those in favor of 14A, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, thank you. Anything else that we have to?
No.
Okay, so 14B through 15B is consent. Do we need to take a vote on that? Okay, those are consent items. Without objections, those move forward. 16 is new business and review of information requests. Do you have any, Ms. Shamani?
I have just the one about Reed Smith providing guidance on delegation.
Thank you. 17 is the draft agenda for the next board meeting. That's obviously July, and those are primarily the work plans. So that's pretty self-explanatory. Any questions about the work for July? Seeing none, opportunities for the public. 17, item 17. Dr. Sandy Keaton.
Oh, don't make me cry, Sandy.
Hey, what's wrong with that?
Dr. Sandy Keaton, United Teachers Los Angeles. At the CTA meeting last weekend, Ed Folia compared retirement to reaching the promised land, and now I'm there. I've learned so much at these meetings. I can't tell you how much over the many, many years that I've attended, and I will truly miss them. Not getting up early, but missing the meetings. I want to thank every staff person. They have been so helpful responding to me with any issues for my members. And I especially want to thank the board, especially my education colleagues who work tirelessly for the educators in California. Thank you.
Dr. Keaton, Ms. Hendricks has a comment.
Sandy, I just wanted to make a quick comment that I'm going to really miss Southwest flights with you and Loretta. Hopefully I'll see Loretta. But I guess, one of the things I just wanted to comment that many of the board might not know is you're just such a tireless advocate for 403B and 457s, the supplement to our CalSTRS defined benefit. And I think, many of us in the room, Maggie, Jennifer, we all really care that teachers have a secure retirement, and we know that CalSTRS defined benefit is the first step, but having that supplemental is so key and starting early. And so I guess I just want to thank you just from teacher to teacher, how much I appreciate. I know how hard it is to put on conferences and nobody goes, wow, thanks so much, Sandy. You know, people take it for granted and you do it every year and you get out the snacks. And, but I guess, you know, what I realize is people might not thank you now, but they're going to thank you in 20 years, you know, when they have something that compounded interest, you know, and so I really appreciate your advocacy in that particular realm, because I think it's an area that a lot of educators don't think about, and so I think you've been so doggedly, you know, you make sure teachers know about it in the state of California. UTLA is really lucky to have you, and we've been lucky to have you here at CalSTRS, and I just really appreciate our friendship, but I love your advocacy that you're just kind of, you know, ruthless about making sure teachers have a secure retirement. So thanks for that, Sandy, and we'll miss you here.
Yeah, Sandy, thank you for your decades of service making a difference in the lives of children in Los Angeles. And I know someone very, very well who, to say that they were in a dark period in their life would be an understatement. I know this person pretty well, and I know for a fact that you reached out to that person and told them that the sun would shine again one day. And I know that person will be forever grateful that you will continue to believe in that person when he or she may have stopped believing in themselves. And I know that person will never forget that. Thank you, Sandy. Anybody else, comments from the public? Okay, Ed Foley, Mr. Foley.
Yeah, Ed Foley.
Final word.
I want to take this opportunity to thank the governor. This might sound a little inconsistent, but we want to welcome Nora. It's been a long haul, but it took maybe 4.5 years, but you are here now representing school districts. We're 91% to our goal of having a full board, and I know that you will do a great job. We want to thank you on behalf of the retirees from CTA. Thank you.
Okay, so with that, we will recognize.
United Teachers, Los Angeles. Retired. I have been coming up here over 25, 30 years as an active and retired. And when I came up here as an active and part of my retired years, up until the last few years, the retired seat has been filled. We look forward to the retired seat being filled. We are retirees. This is a retirement system for us. And we need an advocate sitting in that seat, such as a retiree. We hope that the next meeting, we will have a retiree sitting in the retired seat. We welcome everybody up there. We now have a full board except a retiree. I hope the next time we have that retiree for us retirees.
From her lips to God's ears.
We're going to adjourn our open session. Everyone have a wonderful evening. We'll adjourn and we'll go directly into closed session, and we'll take the closed session to the back room, please. Okay?
Can I just make a quick
Yeah, go ahead,
mention that
Sandy.
for tomorrow, for those of you leaving, tomorrow's investment committee starts at 8:30, and it's going to be upstairs again where we were this morning, just so you know, just for the first part for our private equity consultant interview. So just FYI.